Module 5, Jim Crow Laws. Not only has the United States sought to limit the rights of immigrants and those coming into the country, but they also sought to limit the rights of people actually living in the United States and actually citizens of the United States. Um, in this case, the experiences of African Americans within this country. Now, after the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed in an attempt to try to protect and try to um, protect African American populations and to provide them the ability to vote. Um, but other policies, other situations occurred that eroded the rights of African American citizens from that time. Most notably, the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the case that legislated or legalizes the idea of separate but equal, that allowed this idea of racial segregation. And then from there, this led to many social, economic, and health disparities to result. All walks of life, all public accommodations were segregated by race. So here's an example of a theater specifically for people of color. The idea that you have one theater for white audience, another theater for black audiences. Other legislation was created again to limit the rights of African Americans, specifically rights to restrict their voting. And so you had many jurisdictions creating literacy tests. That is, uh, if they were unable to read and write, they were unable to vote. Uh, they initiated poll taxes. That is, people had to pay a fee in order to vote. They did allow this idea of a grandfather clause so that if your grandfather was able to vote, that they themselves would be allowed to vote. However, there's still a large number of individuals, a large number of African American individuals who were still could not vote because of these existing laws. And it's important to note uh, that the legislation, the Voting Rights Act, was created to do away with these kinds of ways to limit the voting of African American populations. And these laws had its desired effect. The goal of these laws was to restrict the voting rights and the voting power of African Americans within the South, and they effectively done so. Because you can see examples prior to these laws that African Americans were voting upwards of 60% of the population. But once these laws were implemented, that the ability to vote, voting turnout, plummeted. Now, people over this course of time have been fighting against these kinds of laws, restricting the rights of African American men and women in the country. Uh, One of the notable changes occurred in 1954, going back to the Supreme Court, which reversed the earlier law regarding segregation. In the Board versus Board of Education, basically noted that segregation in public schools was illegal and forced that to end. That is not to say, though, that the issue of segregation quickly ended. It still took a number of years before attitudes and other legislation changed to stop segregation. Now the next slide is from 1964 and has the inauguration of Governor George Wallace, where he extols his desire for segregation. So 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education, the issue of segregation was still a powerful issue and was still a factor in many people's lives.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And the civil rights movement continues, focusing on other factors, other situations. In 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott and the action of the Rosa Parks. You have a number of sit-ins. You had basically looking to stop the segregation of public accommodations, restaurants, and so forth. You have the freedom rides, pretty much focusing on the voting of Afro-Americans, men and women. And throughout this, many individuals, both white and black, faced violence and incarceration for their activities. Now, the movement to remove Jim Crow laws and the fight for civil rights was not an easy situation. It took a lot of time, a lot of energy. A lot of people had to face a lot of violence in doing so. The next slide showcases the experiences of a group from 1965 and what happened in Selma, Alabama. This kind of shows you the kind of experiences people were facing as they kind of try to do the kind of work to change social policy.
In March of 1965, CBS News cameras rode along with school children in Alabama during a legendary moment in the civil rights movement.
On Sunday, people gathered on Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge for the anniversary of a brutal showdown there between the protesters and police. Senior White House correspondent Bill Plant, who covered the civil rights movement, returned to Selma yesterday.
The remembrance of Bloody Sunday is a celebration now, but 47 years ago, the violence of that day shocked the nation.
Your order to disperse.
The tiny Alabama town of Selma was the focus of a voting rights campaign, and it met with great local hostility. On a Sunday in March 1965, it exploded into state-sanctioned violence when protesters tried to march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery. John Lewis was 22, a follower of Dr. Martin Luther King. Lewis was one of the two leaders of the march that fateful Sunday. He was beaten, trampled, and tear-gassed when Alabama state troopers charged the marchers at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death.
But this weekend, John Lewis, now a long-serving member of Congress, was back on the bridge. Older now, but still determined.
I think it's important for those that was not even born, not even a dream, to know what happened, know the price that was paid. The only thing I did, I gave a little blood that day.
For the past 12 years, Lewis has been dedicated to making sure America, and particularly the nation's lawmakers, never forget the civil rights struggle. He leads a bipartisan annual pilgrimage for members of Congress to Selma, where the March on Montgomery grew out of a murderous act of violence in nearby Marion. We were there in 1965.
We were among the few newsmen who arrived early enough before the troopers began holding off the press. One Negro was shot in the stomach. He is in critical condition. He says that he thinks the troopers shot him.
That man was Jimmy Lee Jackson. 8 days later, he died. His death was the spark that set off the idea for the March on Montgomery. The planning was done here at Brown Chapel AME Church, where for the previous couple of months, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King had been preaching and praying to register black voters in Alabama.
And I want to thank you for responding to the call.
At a dinner hosted by the governor in the Alabama state capitol, where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president of the Confederacy, and where George Wallace vowed segregation forever, the young people who made the pilgrimage with Lewis sang of a new day. 47 years in the making, and proof that great change is possible in the span of a lifetime.
Bill Plant is with us now. Two things. One, John Lewis was 22 years old.
That's right.
And it reminds you of those brave, all those brave young men and women at that time, also brave young men and women of the Arab Spring of our time. It must have been hard to cover that kind of story without being drawn into it.
Charlie, nothing I have covered in 48 years at CBS News has been as difficult as that to keep myself out of. Because, you know, the Constitution says everybody can vote. And if I believe that, you know, that was not interfering, I hope.
It was painful and empowering to watch at the same time.
It was.